Money can buy a man silence, but it can never buy him the certainty that the silence around him is empty. On the first Friday of October, the dining room at Solène ran the way it always ran on the nights when the reservation book was full of names that appeared on magazine covers, beautifully, frantically, like a swan paddling for its life beneath still water. 2 Michelin stars hung on the wall by the host stand, discreet little plaques most of the guests never bothered to look at because the guests already knew. They were the kind of people who didn't need to read the menu to know what excellence cost. The room smelled of brown butter and old money, and the particular ozone tang of a kitchen pushed to the edge of its capacity. Lena Costa moved through that room like she belonged to it and to no one in it. 28 years old, a black apron knotted twice at the small of her back, a folded linen towel laid across her left forearm, with the kind of precision that came from doing a thing 10,000 times. She had learned, over 3 years on this floor, the most valuable skill a server at Solène could possess, which was the ability to disappear, to set a fresh glass down without a sound, to clear a plate the instant the last bite was gone, to stand at the periphery of a $50,000 table and become, to the people seated there, a piece of furniture that occasionally poured. What none of them knew, what none of them ever bothered to wonder, was that the furniture had spent 3 years as a doctoral candidate in economics at Berkeley before her mother got sick, that the furniture had once stood at a whiteboard explaining the mechanics of securities fraud to a room full of graduate students, that furniture understood with a fluency that would have terrified the men she served exactly how money was moved when somebody wanted it to vanish. She thought about her mother as she rolled silverware in the service alley, the way she thought about her mother during every quiet moment of every shift. Rosa Costa was 59 and had stopped recognizing her own daughter on Tuesdays. Early onset Alzheimer's, the neurologist had said. The words landing in the small exam room like stones dropped down a well. There were good days. On the good days, Rosa hummed the songs her own father used to sing and called Lena by her childhood name and asked, again and again, whether the snow had come yet to the mountains. There were bad days. The bad days cost $11,000 a month at the memory care facility in Daly City, and that was why a woman who had once been 3 chapters from a PhD now folded napkins into perfect cylinders and smiled at men who did not see her. Across the room, the floor manager, a tense, sweating man named Dalton Price, caught her eye and tilted his head toward table 11, the curved banquette in the back corner that the restaurant reserved for the guests it could not afford to disappoint. His face had gone the color of wet paper. "Marsh," he said when she reached him. He said it like a man confessing a sin. "Gideon Marsh. He's already complained about the temperature of the room, and we haven't poured water yet." Lena knew the name, the way everyone in the city knew the name. Gideon Marsh was the founder and chief executive of Halcyon Therapeutics, a biotech firm whose stock had quadrupled in 18 months on the strength of a single drug, an Alzheimer's treatment called Lethra, that was, according to every press release Halcyon issued, the most important medical breakthrough of the decade. Marsh's face was on the cover of business magazines. Marsh gave commencement speeches about disruption and grit. Marsh was, by the rough math Lena did in her head as she walked toward the table, worth somewhere north of $2 billion. He was 44 and handsome in the expensive, sanded-down way of men who had never once in their lives been told no. Beside him sat Sutton Pierce, Halcyon's chief financial officer, and, by every account, Marsh's oldest friend, a leaner, watchful man who laughed only after he checked to see whether Marsh was laughing first. And across from them both sat Vivian Lasher, Marsh's fiancée, a woman whose engagement ring threw small, sharp pieces of light onto the ceiling whenever she lifted her hand, which was often, Lena said, and the smile she wore was real on its surface and nothing underneath. "Welcome to Solène. My name is Lena, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with something sparkling or still?" Marsh did not look up from his phone. He raised 2 fingers and rotated them in a small, lazy circle, the gesture a person might use to indicate that a thing should simply happen, that the how of it was beneath his attention. "Sparkling, no lemon, and tell whoever's running the kitchen tonight that I'll be ordering the tasting menu, but I expect it modified, and I don't want a lecture about it." He still hadn't looked at her. "That's all?" "Of course," Lena said, and went to get the water. When she came back, the 3 of them had stopped speaking English. She heard it before she fully registered what it was. A soft, rounded, almost musical run of syllables, vowels that climbed and fell in a shape her body recognized before her mind did. She had heard those exact cadences her whole childhood in the cramped, warm kitchen of a row house in Queens, from a stonemason with cracked hands and a laugh like gravel. They were speaking Latin. Lena's hand, lowering the water pitcher toward Vivienne's glass, did not shake, but everything inside her went very still and very quiet, the way the air goes still before weather. Latin is a Romance language. Not Italian, though Italians have spent a century insisting otherwise. Not French, not Romanche, though it is a cousin to that last one. It is spoken by perhaps 30,000 people in the high valleys of the Dolomites, Val Badia, Val Gardena, the villages tucked beneath limestone peaks that turn rose gold at dusk. It is, by any honest measure, a dying language. And it was the language of Aldo Costa, Lena's grandfather, who had carried it across an ocean from a town near Corvara and spoken it to her over cocoa on winter mornings, who had taught it to her like a secret handshake between the 2 of them and the mountains he would never see again. To Lena, Latin was the sound of being loved without condition. It was folk songs and the smell of wood smoke and her grandfather's enormous hand closing over hers. To hear it coming out of Gideon Marsh's mouth was like hearing a hymn played in a slaughterhouse. "Look at her wrists," Marsh said, in clean if slightly stiff Latin, and he leaned back into the leather and watched Lena's face with an open, idle cruelty, the way a boy watches an insect he intends to step on. "Bony. They work these little immigrants until there's nothing left. It's almost sad. Almost." Sutton Pierce snorted into his scotch. "She probably sends half of it back to some village," he said, in the same dialect, the words coming a little slower, a little more carefully, wiring $40 a month to a grandmother in Oaxaca. "Don't be vulgar," Vivienne said, smiling, and she said it in Latin too, which meant she'd learned it the same place the men had. The long February weeks in Alta Badia and Cortina, the chalets, the private instructors hired to teach the children of the very rich a charming party trick. "She can't understand you. Look at her." "The lights are on, and no one's home." The 3 of them laughed, low and pleased with themselves, a private little chord of contempt. Lena finished pouring. She set the pitcher down. She looked at Gideon Marsh, and she gave him a smile so warm and so empty that it could have lit a stadium and heated nothing at all. "I'll let the sommelier know you'd like to see the list," she said, in flawless, unhurried English. "Please let me know if there's anything else I can bring." And she walked away, her spine straight, her face serene, the language of her grandfather ringing in her ears like a struck bell. She was not going to cry, because crying was a thing you did when you had no other options, and Lena had just realized she had a great many options. Gideon Marsh believed he was sitting in a soundproof room. He had no idea the walls had ears, and the ears had a graduate education, and the education had spent 3 years learning precisely how men like him hid the things they did. The shift was young, She decided to listen. For the next 90 minutes, she became more attentive than she had ever been at any table in her life, present at every refill, every course, every clearing of a plate, a quiet, diligent ghost. And Marsh, who mistook her diligence for the eager civility of a girl hoping for a fat tip, kept talking. He could not help himself. The cruelty was a tic, a thing he reached for the way other men reached for their phones. "Careful," he told Pierce in Latin as Lena set down the second course, a quivering disc of foie gras under a glass of warm smoke. "Don't let her breathe near the plates. God knows what these people carry. She has a face like a closed door," Vivian observed, turning her fork over, inspecting it for water spots. "No wonder she's serving instead of being served." Lena's jaw stayed loose, her hands stayed steady. Inside, something cold and clean was crystallizing, sentence by sentence, like ice forming on a window pane. Then, somewhere between the fourth course and the fifth, the conversation at table 11 changed. It dropped lower. It lost its lazy, performative edge and took on a different texture, quick, clipped, the texture of men who believe themselves entirely alone. Lena was at the side station, folding a fresh napkin when she heard the word Lethera, and she went motionless. "The Phase 3 numbers are a disaster," Marsh was saying, in Latin, quietly, swirling a glass of Barolo that cost more than Lena's monthly rent. "Worse than a disaster. The drug doesn't work. The cognitive scores in the treatment arm are flat, Sutton. And in 11 patients, it's doing something to the liver we can't explain. 2 of them are in the hospital." Pierce's voice was a low, careful murmur, "And Pruitt is handled." Marsh took a sip and made a small sound of approval at the wine, as though he were discussing nothing more consequential than the vintage. "The principal investigator at the Phoenix site. I wired $75,000 to a consulting LLC his wife controls. The adverse events get coded as unrelated, pre-existing conditions. By the time the FDA finishes its review, the story we've built holds, and if it doesn't hold, it doesn't matter if it holds forever. It only has to hold through the secondary." Marsh leaned in, and his voice dropped further, and Lena had to read the shapes of the harder consonants off his lips. "We file the offering in 3 weeks. I'm personally selling 400 million in stock into that offering, under a 10B5 plan I put in place in August, so it looks scheduled, automatic, nothing to see. By the time the real data leaks and the stock craters, I'm out. Liquid. The retail investors and the pension funds eat the loss. We're insulated." Lena did not move. She did not breathe. She understood every word, and she understood it twice. Once as a granddaughter of the Dolomites, and once as a woman who had stood at a whiteboard and explained to undergraduates what it meant when a corporate officer dumped $400 million of stock on the strength of data he knew to be fraudulent, while patients lay in hospital beds with their livers failing. This was not a rich man being cruel to a waitress. This was a confession. A federal felony laid out in full, in a crowded restaurant, shielded by nothing but a dying mountain language and the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told no. And then she heard the part that made the cold thing inside her go white-hot. "It's almost poetic," Marsh said, and he was smiling now, genuinely amused. "We sell these people hope. Their mothers are forgetting their faces, and we sell them a pill and a press release and a stock chart that goes up. They want so badly to believe. It's the easiest market in the world. Despair, Sutton. There's no margin like despair." Across the room, in a memory care facility in Daly City, a 59-year-old woman who could no longer reliably name her own daughter was, at that moment, asking a nurse whether the snow had come yet to the mountains. Lena set the napkin down, very gently. She walked to the service alley, and she put her back against the cold tile wall, and for the length of one slow breath she let herself shake. She thought of Aldo, who had built half the brownstones in his corner of Queens with his own ruined hands and bowed to no man living. She thought of her mother humming his songs in a room with a coded lock on the door. She thought of $75,000 wired to a doctor's wife to bury the deaths of strangers. Then she stopped shaking, because there was work to do. But Gideon Marsh was not finished, and the next thing he did decided everything. 10 minutes later, carrying a plated course of black cod toward the table, Lena saw it happen through the slim vertical pane in the kitchen door. Marsh reached out, almost tenderly, and lifted a single long dark hair from the shoulder of Vivienne's silk wrap. He held it up to the candlelight, turned to Pierce, and said something in Latin that made both men grin. Lena was close enough now to read it. "Watch this," Marsh said, laying the hair across the center of his half-eaten wagyu. "I'm bored. I'm going to have this entire meal comped, and I'm going to have that girl fired before the dessert course. It's the most fun you can buy for free. You should see how they beg." Vivienne laughed. Pierce raised his glass, and something in Lena that had been bending for 3 years, bending under $11,000 a month, under double shifts, under the slow erasure of the only parent she had left. That thing did not break. It set. Like concrete, like the stone her grandfather used to cut, because here was the arithmetic. Gideon Marsh did not know he was doing. If Lena lost this job tonight, the November payment to the facility would not be made, and if the November payment was not made, her mother would be moved, and a woman with advanced Alzheimer's who is moved from the place that has become her only anchor does not, the doctors had warned, tend to come back from it. Gideon Marsh, for the amusement of his dinner companions, was about to gamble with the last good months of Rosa Costa's mind, and he would never even know he'd done it. Lena turned and walked into Dalton Price's cramped office. The floor manager was hunched over the reservation tablet, sweating, and he flinched when she came in. "Whatever it is," he said, "the answer is no." "That's Gideon Marsh out there. His foundation underwrites the gala that half our private event clients attend. He is not a man we cross. He's about to tell you there was a hair in his food," Lena said. Her voice was level, almost gentle. "He's going to demand the meal be comped, and he's going to demand that you fire me on the floor in front of the room. I'm telling you before he does it." He put the hair there himself. I watched him do it. Price's eyes went wide and then immediately, helplessly, slid away from hers. He stood. He paced the 2 steps the office allowed. "Lena, even if that's true, even if it's exactly true, what am I supposed to do? Call a billionaire a liar in my own dining room?" "You're supposed to do what's right," she said. "I'm supposed to keep the lights on." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "Look, take the rest of the night. Take the weekend. We'll talk Monday. I have to protect the restaurant. You understand? You have to understand." She looked at him for a long moment, and what she felt was not anger, but a strange, almost clarifying pity. Dalton Price was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, and frightened men had built every system that had ever protected someone like Gideon Marsh and sacrificed someone like Lena Costa without a second thought. He was not going to save her. No one in this building was going to save her. She was, it turned out, entirely on her own. And being entirely on her own, she realized, meant she no longer had to ask anyone's permission for anything. "Don't worry about it, Dalton," she said quietly. "I'll handle table 11 myself." Before he could answer, she was gone. She crossed the dining room at an unhurried pace, and the lights caught something in her face that made a few of the nearer guests glance up from their plates. At table 11, Gideon Marsh had just lifted his hand, drawn his breath, and opened his mouth to summon the manager he intended to humiliate. Lena reached the table first. She set the black cod down in the center of it with a soft, final click, and she did not bow her head, and she did not produce the trembling, apologetic smile he was waiting for. She stood straight, and she met his eyes the way a person meets the eyes of something she has decided to stop being afraid of. "Is there a problem with your Wagyu, Mr. Marsh?" she asked in English, and she pitched her voice to Carrie. Not loud, exactly, but clear enough that the conversations at the two nearest tables faltered and stopped. His sneer arrived right on schedule. He pointed one manicured finger at his plate. "A problem? There's a hair in my food. A long, filthy hair, right there in the center of a $180 piece of beef. This is repulsive. This is a 2-star restaurant, and you let people like you handle the plates." He sat back, satisfied, performing for the room now. "I want your manager, and I want you gone. You're finished. You're fired." Pierce smirked. Vivian sighed theatrically, and reached for her phone, distancing herself from the small, unpleasant scene. Lena looked down at the hair. She looked, deliberately, slowly, at the long, dark strands of Vivian's hair where they fell against her pale silk wrap. Then she looked back at Gideon Marsh, and she did not speak in English. She spoke in Latin. "It's a beautiful hair, Gideon," she said, and her accent was perfect, the round mountain vowels rolling out of her with an ease his hired instructors had never managed to teach him. "But we both know whose it is. I watched you lift it off Vivian's shoulder a few minutes ago and lay it on the meat yourself." The effect was not gradual, it was a demolition. The color left Marsh's face all at once, the way water leaves a tipped glass. His jaw came open and produced nothing. He stared at her, at the apron, the cheap black uniform, the face he had spent the last 2 hours describing as empty, and his entire understanding of the room he was sitting in came apart in real time. Sutton Pierce made a strangled sound and inhaled his scotch, coughing into his napkin. Vivian's head snapped up from her phone so fast her earrings swung. "What?" Marsh whispered. He had switched to English. The word came out thin and cracked. "What did you say?" Lena placed her palms flat on the edge of the table and leaned in, and she went back to Latin, because she wanted him to feel every syllable of it, wanted the language he had used as a weapon turned around in his own hand. "I said you're a liar," she said, "and I said that my wrists may be thin and my hands may be rough, but at least there's nothing rotting inside me the way it's rotting inside you." She straightened, and she turned to Vivian, and she switched to English. Clear, public English. English for the listening room. "He doesn't love you," she said simply. Then, gently, almost kindly, she dropped back into Latin for the knife. "Page 80 of your prenuptial agreement. He's tied your entire settlement to an offshore holding company in the Caymans that he's deliberately running into the ground. If he leaves you, and he's planning to leave you, you walk away with the jewelry and nothing else. He told his friend that while I was pouring your wine 3 weeks ago, he thought you couldn't hear him either." Vivian's hand rose slowly to her mouth. She turned to look at Marsh, and the thing that crossed her face was not heartbreak. It was calculation, fast and merciless, the look of a woman who had just understood the man across from her completely. "Gideon," she said, very quietly, "is that true?" He couldn't answer. He was hyperventilating now, his eyes darting around the silent room, and every table within earshot had abandoned all pretense and was simply watching. Lena leaned in one last time. Her voice dropped to almost nothing, and it was as cold as the wind that came off the high peaks of Valbadia in January. "And as for Lethera," she said, in Latin, soft enough that only the 3 of them could hear, the flat cognitive scores, the 11 patients with liver injury, the $75,000 you wired to Dr. Pruitt's wife to make 2 deaths disappear, the $400 million in stock you're dumping into a secondary you know is built on fraud, while families with sick parents buy your hope at retail. She let that hang for a single heartbeat. I have a mother in a memory care unit, Gideon. So I wonder, how do you think the SEC and the FDA are going to feel about all of it? Sutton Pierce stood up so fast his chair toppled and cracked against the floor. We're leaving, he said, his voice climbing toward panic, his lawyer's mind already racing through the catastrophe of having confessed to securities fraud and bribery in front of a witness who understood every word. Gideon, get up! But Gideon Marsh could not get up. He sat pinned to the banquette, staring at Lena as though she had been conjured out of the limestone of mountains he had only ever seen from a heated chairlift, a thing summoned specifically and personally for his undoing. "Who are you?" he breathed. Lena reached behind her back and untied her apron. "My name is Lena Costa," she said, in English now, in clean, ringing English that carried to the farthest corner of the dining room. "My grandfather was Aldo Costa from Corvara in the Dolomites. He cut stone with his hands for 40 years and never once made his money off of somebody else's suffering." She lifted the apron over her head. "And you don't get to fire me, Gideon. I wouldn't carry a glass of water across this room for a man like you if my life depended on it. And it used to. That's the part you'll never understand." She set the folded apron down on the table beside the contaminated steak with the same care she'd have used to set down a $1,000 bottle. Vivian Lasher did not wait for her fiancé. She rose, gathered her clutch, looked at Gideon Marsh for one long final second, and then she picked up her glass of Barolo and emptied it into his lap before she walked out, her heels striking the floor like gunfire all the way to the door. Lena turned her back on the wreckage and walked out of the dining room of Solène. Dalton Price stood frozen by the host stand. Nobody stopped her. The two Michelin stars watched from the wall and said nothing, because stars never do. The October air on the sidewalk was sharp and clean and tasted, improbably, like the best thing she had ever breathed. But Lena knew the night was not over, and she knew better than to mistake a clean exit for a victory. Gideon Marsh was a wounded animal with $1 billion and a wall of lawyers, and wounded animals with resources do not slink away. They retaliate. If she simply went home and waited, he would find a way to bury her, to discredit her, to drown her in litigation, to make sure that whatever she'd heard could never be more than the hysterical claim of a fired waitress with a grudge. She needed to move first, and she needed to move where his money could not follow. She sat on a cold bench on a side street off Fillmore, her heart still hammering, and she did the thing 3 years of graduate training had prepared her for without her ever knowing why. She did not call the police. Local precincts were too easily reached by men like Marsh. She opened her phone, and she went to the website of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, to the office of the whistleblower, and she began to read the intake requirements. Then she searched for the name of an investigative reporter at a national business paper, a woman named Adrienne Quill, who had spent a decade taking apart fraudulent biotech firms and had the scars to show for it. She wrote the email the way she would once have written a dissertation, methodically, precisely, every claim load-bearing, the drug Lethera, the flat phase 3 cognitive data, the 11 cases of unexplained hepatotoxicity, 2 of them hospitalized, the $75,000 wire to a consulting LLC controlled by the wife of the Phoenix site principal investigator Dr. Pruitt to recode adverse events as unrelated, the planned secondary offering 3 weeks out, the $400 million in personal stock sales structured under a 10b5-1 plan adopted in August after the data was already known to be bad, the exact phrasing of the confession, the date, the witness, Sutton Pierce, Chief Financial Officer of Halcyon Therapeutics, who had sat across the table and asked the follow-up questions. She read it twice. She fixed 1 comma. She sent it. What followed was not a scandal. It was a controlled demolition. Adrian Quill did not delete the email because the email did not read like a grudge. It read like a roadmap drawn by someone who plainly understood securities law better than most of the lawyers Quill knew. Within 48 hours, she had pulled the public 10b5-1 filing and confirmed its August adoption date. Within a week, she had cross-referenced the consulting LLC against incorporation records in Arizona and matched it to Dr. Pruitt's wife. And when Quill's first call reached Dr. Pruitt himself, a tired, frightened man who had a mortgage and a conscience and no appetite whatsoever for federal prison, he folded in under 20 minutes, and then he called a lawyer, and then he called the FDA. 9 days after the dinner at Solène, federal agents executed search warrants at the Halcyon Therapeutics headquarters. The secondary offering was pulled. Trading was halted, and when it resumed, the stock fell 70% in a single session. Gideon Marsh was arrested in the marble lobby of his own building, in front of the neighbors he had spent a decade looking down on, and the photograph of him in handcuffs ran above the fold of every paper in the country. The charges were a litany: securities fraud, wire fraud, bribery, obstruction. The board of Halcyon, desperate to salvage what was left of the company's value, stripped him of his title and his shares and issued a press release, disowning him so cold it could have frosted glass. Sutton Pierce, facing the witness tampering and conspiracy exposure of his own confession, negotiated a cooperation deal and gave the prosecutors everything. And Vivian Lasher, true to Lena's word, hired the most ferocious divorce attorney in the city and used the public fraud to void the prenuptial agreement entirely, walking away with a settlement carved out of Marsh's assets before the government could freeze them. For Lena, the reckoning came slowly, the way real things do. It took 11 months of depositions and document requests and a great deal of anxious waiting in a quiet upstairs office at the SEC, because her information had directly led the commission to a successful enforcement action. Because the penalties levied against Halcyon and against Marsh personally ran into the hundreds of millions, she qualified under the whistleblower program for an award calculated as a percentage of what the government recovered. The check, when it finally came, was for $3,100,000. She paid off the memory care facility through the end of her mother's life in a single afternoon, and then she moved Rosa out of the locked unit in Daly City and into a small house in Sonoma, north of the fog line, with a private nurse and a porch, and a stand of oaks that turned gold in October. On the good mornings, Rosa sat on that porch with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, and she hummed the old songs, her own father's songs, Aldo's songs, the ones with the round climbing vowels. And sometimes she looked out at the dry golden hills and asked her daughter whether the snow had come yet to the mountains. And Lena, who had finally gone back and finished the degree, who had a framed diploma on the wall of a study that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, would sit down beside her and take her rough, familiar hand and answer her in the language they had both inherited from a stonemason who bowed to no one. "Not yet, Mama," she would say in Latin, soft as falling snow. Soon, any day now, her grandfather had crossed an ocean and left her nothing a bank would recognize, no trust, no shares, no holding company in the Caymans. He had left her a dying language and a straight spine, and with the two of them, she had brought down a man worth $2 billion, who never once thought to wonder whether the furniture could hear. Money, it turned out, could buy a great many things. It could not buy the one thing Gideon Marsh had needed most on that Friday night in October, which was the simple, unpurchasable knowledge of exactly who was standing beside his table and exactly where she had come from and exactly what she understood.